room. Let's speak to Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, joins us from Jerusalem, and George Galloway, former MP and broadcaster. And George, you're concerned listening to that, I could tell.
Yes, I don't know Shaka Amer. I dare say his political stripe is different to mine. I have no reason to disbelieve him. I'm not after John, the Englishman in the room. I'm after the politicians who must have known if John was in the room and must have known that there were many Johns in many rooms. Many of the British people taken during and after the war in Afghanistan have testified that the questions that were being put to them could only have been framed by the British intelligence services. There were questions too specific to have been dreamt up by American interrogators. And it's my belief now, as it was at the time, as I said over and over in the House of Commons, that the British government was complicit in the torture even of British citizens and British residents like Shaka Amer.
Colonel Richard Kemp, do you think that sounds right to you?
I don't believe that we have any reason to assume that what Shaka Amer is alleging is true. Of course, this is a classic Al-Qaeda counter-interrogation and propaganda technique, and Shaka Amer is still believed by US authorities to have been a very active, militarily trained Al-Qaeda operative.
That's just a lie. That's just a lie.
He would
it's
classically
a smear
use this kind
and
of
a lie.
He would classically use this kind of attempt to smear the British government.
Hang on. In 2007, he was cleared of all allegations. That is a libel. It's defamatory. It's a deliberate smear and lie. And no wonder it's coming from Jerusalem.
It's no good George Galloway shouting like that. It won't change the fact that he is still believed by the US authorities, who have intelligence on this, that Shaka Amer is an experienced, trained Al-Qaeda terrorist.
So, hang on, I'm trying to work out how we get to the bottom of that, Richard Kemp, because you've just said something serious about him. My understanding is they dropped all the charges, and we don't really have any evidence against him, but you've obviously seen some, have you?
Well, they haven't dropped the charges. They've released him, but they haven't done so because they believe he's guilty. They dropped the charges in 2007. That's a matter of fact. The Americans have not dropped any charges against him. They still believe that he's guilty of being an Al-Qaeda terrorist.
This is outrageous, Jeremy.
They have released him on account of the fact that President Obama wishes to shut down Guantanamo Bay and release as many prisoners as he can, and because the British have put pressure on them to release this man.
So you are happy for there to have been an Englishman in the room, Richard Kemp, on the basis that you think this man is a terrorist, is that right?
Well, I don't believe that we can assume there was an Englishman in the room. Why would this man be telling the truth? I mean, his own lawyer has said he's psychotic and mentally deranged. In fact, more than one of his lawyers have said that. Why would we believe what he says? I worked very closely with the British intelligence services over this period. I wasn't a member of the intelligence services. I worked closely with them. I do not believe for one moment that British intelligence services will be complicit in torture or misuse or abuse of any prisoner. I know that the British government...
Waterboarding and so on?
And of course they're not. Why would they be complicit in that?
Well, being in the room would be complicit, wouldn't it?
I believe it would be, but I don't believe it's very likely they would have been. I don't know that for a fact, but I think it's highly unlikely that, first of all, that the intelligence services would have wanted to do that, and secondly, that if the government, as George Galloway suggests, that government ministers would have been aware, I very much doubt that government ministers would approve that.
Okay, George Galloway.
Well, in 2002, the United States offered to send all the British citizens and Mr. Amer back to Britain, and the Blair Straw administration said they didn't want them back. That means they were content for these British citizens and residents to continue to rot in Bagram Air Base, in Abu Ghraib Jail, and in Guantanamo Bay. That in itself is a damning indictment on Mr. Blair.
Prisoners of war who need to be detained rather than continue to try and murder British citizens and our allies.
You're obviously too stupid to have been in the intelligence services, because if you weren't,
it's a good way to make your argument by attacking the person that you're arguing.
Okay, hang on, guys, hang on.
Because if you weren't, you wouldn't have described them as prisoners of war.
I said they were enemy prisoners.
Prisoners, you said prisoners of war. No, they were not.
You can attack me as much as you want.
Hang on, George. George, just a sec. Hang on, Richard Kemp. Does it cut any ice with you that he did go out before 9/11 to Afghanistan because he said he wanted to do charity work and find somewhere nice to live?
Yes, and it hasn't been disclosed which charity it was, although one of the charities he said he was involved with was the Revival of Islamic Heritage Society, which has been put on the UN Al-Qaeda sanctions list and also been sanctioned by the US Treasury as
It
being
doesn't look
associated
good,
with
George
Al-Qaeda.
Galloway, does it?
Well, I really don't think we should be putting Shakar Amer on trial here on the radio. Least of all,
we can certainly discuss his background.
Least of all, with the
he himself
prosecutor.
has admitted doing it.
Least of all, with the prosecutor being in Jerusalem, that well-known torture centre. It would be far better if we discussed that which we know to be true. We know that it's true that the Americans offered to send all these British people back in 2002, and we know that the British government refused to take them. We know that Shakar Amer was cleared for release in 2007, and we know that it took to 2015 to get him back and reunited with his family.
He's Saudi Arabian, right? So he's resident in the UK. Why should Britain take him back?
Well, because he was an official resident. Have you seen Saudi Arabia?
Well,
would you want to go back to Saudi Arabia?
But he's not a British citizen.
He was a British resident. That's an official status. My own wife is a British resident. If you are implying that there are no rights attached to that, you're wrong. He was also the husband of a British woman and the father of several British children. So Britain had a responsibility to them and claimed, actually, that they were exercising it with a great lack of response from their closest ally, the United States, it would appear. Now, these are the things that we know. We know that all the British residents, all the British citizens and this resident did claim that there were Englishmen in the room. And it's stretching credulity to believe that when Britain and America were such close allies in this conflict, when Britain didn't want the prisoners back, that it didn't know what was happening to them. Indeed, Mr. Blair himself annotated an official memo which stated from British intelligence, I'm not blaming them in this, that British people were being tortured.
Okay, Colonel Richard Kemp, should we be in the room even if something bad is happening? That's the question here, because there might be people who say, look, at least you want to watch it.
No, certainly not.
So you just stay out the room, do you?
You should not be involved either actively or passively in torturing or abusing prisoners. It's not what the British government does. It's not part of the British security services policy. And
well, he was being shouted at and had frozen water poured over him. That would be included, would it?
I think so. Being shouted at, I don't know. I think being doused in water or having his head bounced off the wall would be. But I think I'd like to go back to what George Galloway said about him having been cleared of all allegations. He hasn't been cleared of any allegations. He was cleared for release, but that's different from being cleared of allegations against him.
The Americans, why wasn't he put on trial?
There's a very good reason why he wasn't put on trial, George.
Tell us. The nation waits.
Do you want to listen to a stupid man about this?
Well,
go for it, Richard. This is your moment.
Okay, well, I will. The reality is, of course, that he was picked up in Afghanistan. He'd been fighting, according to American intelligence, he'd been fighting in Tora Bora against Americans and against the Northern Alliance. He was a member of Al-Qaeda. He was associated, according to 7 other witnesses in Guantanamo Bay, with Al-Qaeda. He was also accused by Moazzam Beg of being involved with Al-Qaeda. So he's got a track record there, but there is not the kind of evidence you can use in court, because when he was collected in a war zone,
he was collected by bounty hunters, actually, not by the Americans.
Military forces are not in a position to collect intelligence in a war zone.
Thank you very much.
It's not like a criminal sign in London.
We have to leave it there. I hope that's been equally balanced. Thank you both, George Galloway, former MP and broadcaster, and Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, speaking to us from Jerusalem.